The content of the Semantic Code is the meaning of the biblical text in relationship to life today. The Semantic Code includes the sermon's themes, ideas, or messages, and includes also the way that these messages are organized into a whole. So it also includes then sermon organization. There are many different ways that this organization can happen, this organization of themes and ideas and messages. I like to say that styles of semantic coding are defined by the way that preachers manage the arrival of meaning in a sermon, how they parcel out the bits and pieces of the overall message that they are preaching. There are two basic semantic styles that I call connotative style and denotative style. And there are two sub-styles roughly within each of these styles. So within the connotative style, we will discuss an artistic style and a conversational style. Within the denotative style, we will discuss two other sub-styles, an assertive style and a defensive style. The semantic code over time supports or sponsors or builds up what I call the intertext of truth. The way that a preacher handles his or her message over time supports or encourages or builds up the way that a congregation is taught to handle or hold Christian truth. And this truth can be held very openly and loosely, as in connotative styles, or more tightly, as in denotative styles. And we will say more about this as we go along. So let's move on into looking at what constitutes a connotative style. Now, connotative preaching is ruled by the principle of semantic motion, of the movement, of the motion of meaning. Connotative thinkers, if you're a connotative thinker, you're less concerned with primary meanings and you're more interested in secondary meanings or with moving toward primary meanings, the first dictionary meaning of something, by way of secondary meanings. For you, if you're a connotative preacher, meaning is constantly being detoured. It's constantly in motion so that meaning arrives in little bits and pieces. So what the preacher in a connotative style is talking about, theme, message, ideas, is more ambiguous. It's handled in a way that's a bit more unsettled. So there are two connotative styles, artistic and conversational, and we'll get to those in just a minute. But as I said, each of these styles, connotative and denotative, supports an intertext of truth. And the connotative style supports an intertext of what I call disclosive truth. Over time, preachers who use one or the other of these connotative styles are promoting an overarching intertext of disclosive truth. They are telling people that Christian truth is disclosed or uncovered, like peeling back the layers of all the things that hide truth. Truth is hidden or concealed, and this means that anticipation or expectation is the basic condition that's necessary for all truth. Truth then is the object of desire. Okay, let's look at the first of these connotative styles. The first one I call an artistic style. One way to keep meaning in motion is to artfully delay its arrival. This is what artists, and especially narrative artists, are really good at. The preacher as artist delays the arrival of sermonic meaning or sequential meaning, delaying the arrival of meaning within a sequence of a sermon, or delaying the arrival of meaning over the entire sermon itself. Sermons are designed to get and keep people on the hook. As one narrative theorist said, they provide a semantic tick but delay a talk. The great cultural critic and narrative theorist Roland Barthes identified 5 key elements in the artistic delay of meaning. The first of these he calls the enigma. In Eugene Lowry's book, The Homiletical Plot, he calls this upsetting equilibrium. The enigma is a problem that energizes the sermon's forward movement. Something is wrong that needs fixing, or something is out of balance that needs restoration to balance, or something is missing that needs to be found, or something is confusing and needs to be clarified, and so on. The enigma. The second one of these elements, or tropes, if you will, is the jam. A jam, according to Roland Barthes, is the deepening of an enigma. So we have an enigma, and then it gets worse. We take it a step further. It becomes more complicated, more ambiguous. Here the preacher takes time to acknowledge the depth and the breadth and the apparent insolubility, if you will, of the sermon's enigma. A jam is a way of digging oneself a little deeper into a hole, if you will. The third element is what Barthes calls the snare. This is what is commonly known as a wild goose chase or the straw man. The snare is a false resolution. We're led down a path, and then we discover, oh, that's not it. If you think about crime drama or whodunits, this is someone who we think might have done it, but we discover that they're really an imposter in that role. The snare is an imposter who we discover, only masquerades as the hero of our story or the resolution for our story. Fourthly is the clue. A clue is a partial resolution or a glimpse of what might be most significant in resolving the enigma at hand. In some crime dramas, the clue is delayed till the very last second, and then we begin to see how everything unfolds and makes sense. So a clue is a partial resolution or a glimpse of what might be most significant in resolving the enigma. And then fifth is a resolution or a resolving image, if you will, one or the other. At the end of the sermon, the preacher may want to resolve the semantic tension that's been created. This is a matter of establishing or reestablishing some kind of equilibrium or restoring some form of order. Now, if the preacher wants to remain fully artistic, that is, to keep semantic ambiguity going even while providing a partial resolution, the preacher might use a resolving image or story to conclude the sermon instead of telling the congregation how tension is actually resolved. There are three other tropes that are sometimes used and are worth mentioning. Code delay is a way of ordering a sequence, ordering the codes of a sequence, so that the semantic code arrives last. If you want to have an artistic style, one way to do it is within each sequence of thought in your sermon to delay the arrival of what you're talking about until last in that sequence. You might tell a story, provide scriptural images, use the other codes, do some theological framing, but not really tell us what the message for us is until the end of this sequence. And this kind of delay can even be sermonic. You can have an entire sermon, best if it's a more brief sermon, in which scripture and then pictures from our own experience and theological framing are done, and the semantic code, your message, arrives at the very end of the sermon itself. A second one is what I call flickering. And that's simply permitting an idea to arrive only in little bits and pieces or flickers. This is sometimes accomplished by introducing a subject and then letting your congregation hear you angle toward the predicate by approximation. This is a ploy that Fred Craddock, who's one of the great artistic connotative preachers, used a good bit, where he would give you a word like peace, and then he would say, when I say this word, what comes to mind? And then he would tell a story. He would say, what I see, what comes to mind for me is this, and then he would tell a story. And then he'd say the word again, peace, and then he would tell another story, and then maybe he'd say it again and give you another kind of story as the predicate for that word peace. And as he did that, he would be building what in fact that word means and giving you both a subject and a predicate. But it would take some time. So this kind of flickering, if you will, of meaning is another way to think about doing this. Or personification. This is another thing Fred Craddock does. Joanna Adams does this as well, and that is to create a persona for an idea. Fred Craddock talks about, if I can remember well, death with his yellow face walking down the highway, or pushing his way into a room, and so on. So instead of telling us that death is scary, simply creating a persona, an image for death. Or Joanna Adams talks about somebody arriving at her door while she's tucked down under her Afghan. And this is the text, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." But for her, it's somebody who is coming and wants to, as she says, ultimately give her life. It winds up being people who she really doesn't want to engage, but who are really the people who are bringing Christ to her, the poor, the outcast, the oppressed. So creating a persona for an idea is another way to delay the arrival of meaning in sermons. Okay, so if this is a preacher's style, over time, preachers who use this style, they're telling their congregations that Christian truth is an epiphany. The word epiphany meaning showing forth or a manifestation, an event, something that happens. Truth is an expected event within a certain sort of field of meaning or trajectory of meaning that requires the listener to participate to some extent in taking hold of it. Meaning Christian truth is anticipated, and then within the field of that anticipation, it happens. It arrives. It becomes manifest to us. Creativity theorists speak of this as an insight or an aha, to use the language that Eugene Lowry used in his book, The Homiletical Plot. Meaning arrives sometimes when we go outside the lines in order to solve a cognitive conflict or a problem or a puzzle. It's that moment when the puzzle piece fits. That's what truth is. It's an epiphany. And so the congregation is being invited to reason by inference, if you will, from the particulars of their own experience and similar forms of experience toward universals or concepts. We invite them with this kind of preaching to think intuitively and to prefer religious ideas that theologically thematize their deepest intuitions, or that solve what one philosopher called the puzzlement of the world by taking them outside the lines. So truth is a discovery. It arrives as an insight, a realization, a recognition, an epiphany. So over time in a congregation, this is what we're telling people truth is if we preach in the artistic style of semantic coding.
To tell the truth, it feels like an intrusion, doesn't it? I mean, there you sit, the fire is lit, the shades are drawn, your slippers are on, you are content in a self-contained world. You have worked hard to make it that way, and it feels like an intrusion, doesn't it? Because there you are, safe behind walls you have carefully constructed, and then out of the blue there is a knock on the door. It's not a loud and abrasive, insistent knock, mind you. It's just loud enough and just insistent enough that you can't just sit there under your Afghan and pretend you didn't hear that someone was at the door. There is a knock, and you groan to yourself, who could that be? Just when I've gotten all settled at a time like this, everything's just the way I like it. So grumpily you get up and go to the door and release the locks. Grudgingly you open it. And standing there is a perfect stranger. Gruffly you ask the stranger, "What do you want from me?" "I don't want anything from you," the stranger answers. "I've come to give you something." What could you possibly have that I would need, you ask? Your life, the stranger answers. I have come to give you your life. And you mumble something about having given at the office yourself, and you shut the door, and you settle back down under the asking, and you mutter to yourself, he disturbed you, the stranger, and you can't forget him. Who does he think he is, you ask yourself? It is the wrong question, of course. The question is not, who does he think he is? The question is, who do we think that he is? Who do they think they are, bursting in on my special day, I thought. It was my first Sunday in my first parish, a downtown Atlanta church. As minister to the community, I had been called to Grand Old Central Pres. It was a Pentecost Sunday, I remember. I wore a red dress with big white buttons down the front, and everything was mighty festive. There was punch and cookies after church, pretty flowers on the tables, and everybody looked so nice and acted so nice and smelled so nice. Everybody was so nice. I had pretty much decided that going into the ministry was just about the nicest thing anybody could do. And then, right in the middle of the reception, someone tapped me on the shoulder and pointed to the door of the fellowship hall and said, "They're all yours, Joanna." And I looked in the direction of the pointing, and there was a couple, a sad, bedraggled-looking twosome, who had quite literally seen the cross on the top of the church and had had the nerve to welcome the church's welcome party for the new associate pastor. They were not welcome anywhere, of course. She was mentally ill. He, obviously, physically ill, homeless, hopeless. I tried to help them, made some phone calls, and found out that on a Sunday afternoon in Atlanta, Georgia, a great and gracious city with the motto, "The city too busy to hate," we had just been too busy to find a place for poor people to be, I guess. And when you're busy, you have other things on your mind, and it was late afternoon before I got the couple situated. The men's mission would take him, the women's mission would take her, but only after phone calls from a pastor and some money. When I took him to the men's mission, they cried as we stopped the car, having to separate from one another. The missions are miles apart, and neither they nor the new preacher in town were sure they would ever see each other again. I have thought of them often since. Those two who came to save me the very first day of my ministry, from an understanding of ministry that would want to keep the cares of the world out of the church. The strangers blessed me and shaped my ministry in a very deep and profound way. What could you possibly have that I need, you ask the stranger. Your life, the stranger answers. I have come to give you your life, and is it not so? In whatever city you live in, Hopewell, Virginia, or Dublin, Pennsylvania, or East Hampton, New York, or Ypsilanti, Michigan, that the churches that are dying are the ones that are all locked up tight as a tick, and the ones that are alive are the ones that aren't afraid to open the door and let the fresh wind of the Spirit blow through, because left on our own, we would be content, this Church of Jesus Christ, we would be content to count our communion cups and put on cantatas, and we would convince ourselves that such is the life of faith.
I'm going to say a word, and the moment I say the word, I want you to see a face. to recall a face and a name, someone who comes to your mind when I say the word. Are you ready? The word is bitter. Bitter. Do you see a face? I see a face. I see the face of a farmer in western Oklahoma, riding a mortgaged tractor, burning gasoline purchased on the credit, moving across rented land, rearranging the dust. Bitter. Do you see a face? I see the face of a woman 47 years old. She sits out on a hillside, drawn and confused under a green canopy furnished by the mortuary. She is banked on all sides by flowers sprinkled with cards. You have our condolences. Bitter. Do you see a face? I see the face of a man who runs a small grocery store. His father ran the store in that neighborhood for 20 years, and he is now in his 12th year. The grocery doesn't make much profit, but it keeps the family together. It's a business. There are no customers in the store now, and the grocer stands in the doorway with his apron rolled up around his waist, looking across the street where workmen are completing a supermarket. Bitter. I see the face of a young couple. They seem to be about 19. They're standing in the airport terminal, holding hands so tight their knuckles are white. She's pregnant. He's dressed in military green. They're not talking, just standing and looking at each other. The loudspeaker comes on. Flight 392, now loading at gate 22, Yellow Concourse, all aboard for San Francisco. He slowly moves toward the gate. She stands there alone. Bitter. Do you see a face? A young minister in a small town in a cracker box of a house they call a parsonage. He lives there with his wife and small child. It's Saturday morning. There is a knock at the door. He answers, and there standing before him on the porch is the chairman of his church board, who is also the president of the local bank, and also the owner of most of the land round about. The man has in his hands a small television. It's an old television, small screen, black and white. It's badly scarred, and one of the knobs is off. He says, my wife and I got one of those new 25-inch color sets, but they didn't want to take this one on a trade, so I just said to myself, well, we'll just give it to the minister. That's probably the reason our ministers don't stay any longer than they do. We don't do enough nice things for them. The young minister looks up, tries to smile and say thanks, but I want you to see his face. Bitter.
The second connotative style, if we move on now, is what I call the conversational style. And in this style, semantic motion, which is what connotation really requires of us, is achieved not by semantic delay, that's the artistic style, but what I call semantic reciprocity. Semantic motion is achieved by following the back and forth of a dialogue in pursuit of a shared meaning. So instead of keeping meaning in motion through semantic delay, that's the artistic style, meaning is kept in motion through semantic reciprocity, through the kinds of shifts in approaching and learning something and making meaning that take place through a good conversation or a good dialogue. Now, there are several common tropes to look for in conversational preaching. Those of you who are doing sermon analysis will look for these kinds of things. You might notice contrapuntals. A contrapuntal is an acknowledgement of a potential misunderstanding. So when the preacher knows about actual oppositions to an idea or of typical misunderstandings that might be in the room, then they can simply acknowledge that these exist. It's the kind of thing that would happen in a conversation where we say, we all know this, but we're not going to go there. David Buttrick calls this a contrapuntal. According to Buttrick, and here I quote, a contrapuntal acknowledges but does not reinforce an opposition. So the preacher acknowledges alternative perspectives on a meaning that's being pursued, but then lets us know we're not going in that direction. This is accomplished by a variety of ways, by raising questions that acknowledge other points of view, by revising one's perspective midstream, or simply by briefly noting common misunderstandings. So we're kind of narrowing the field of meaning when we do this kind of contrapuntal work. A second rhetorical trope that we might look for is the language of following. And this is language in which the preacher acknowledges that they are following the hearer's lead in pursuing a topic. Many of you have asked about blah, blah, blah. Some of you have seemed very concerned recently about this. Or when I talk to many of you, this is what I hear. So we acknowledge that our ideas as preacher, as in a good conversation, are following the lead of those who are listening to us. Okay, the third trope or rhetorical clue or cue here is what I call qualification. In this style, the preachers will use more qualifiers. They'll qualify what they're saying, permitting other perspectives to exist. So we're going to hear in this style more words like perhaps, or maybe, or it might be, or it seems that, or even in my opinion, I think that, or for many of us, right, there's another kind of a qualifier. So the language of may or might or qualification, we're gonna hear that kind of language more. And this is a way of sort of permitting a conversation to remain open, but also to remain focused to some extent on a particular topic. Fourthly, the language of revision or repair. And here, the preacher indicates that they are in fact revising their own ideas in light of other information that they have gotten from you, the people in the pew who are sitting at the round table with you, okay? So if we have that image in mind, there are moments when we want to say, hey, I'm thinking differently now. So this information may come from Scripture or other sources, and in this way, these sources are also included as partners in the conversation. So revision sometimes involves some self-disclosure. It may even involve self-correction or the repair of an idea. We might say something like, until recently I thought this, but after listening to some of you, this is what I'm starting to think now. So we begin to feel our semantic reciprocity, if you will, actually revising the way that the preacher thinks. All right, another one of these tropes that we will hear is what I call empathic responding. And here the preacher will paraphrase perhaps what the preacher senses to be the listener's feelings about a topic being discussed. It's difficult to gain access, of course, to actual feelings, and even more difficult to avoid imputing feelings that don't exist. So it might be good to use qualifiers here as well, may or might, just to help avoid constricting the hearer's feelings as you are empathic. It could be that many of you are feeling this way about this right now. So there's a kind of following element to it, but it's a little more empathic in nature and leans into the feelings that we are trying to follow up on without imputing those feelings. The next trope is simply interruption. Interruptions occur frequently in conversations. In most cases, they occur in order to make sure that someone gets heard who may not be heard any other way, or it could be that someone's being hurt by what's being said, or there's simply complete and utter falsity in what the usual line of thinking is. Somebody's feeling stereotyped or whatever. So we can do this also in sermons. We can say, wait a minute, it just occurred to me, or this is not going to work. This really doesn't make much sense, and let me tell you why. conversation stylists will actually sometimes interrupt their own train of thought, as might happen in a good conversation, and just simply say, wait a minute, let me break in here and remind us of something that we may be forgetting if we keep going in this direction. Interruption. Next, convergence. These next two are really closely aligned. Convergence, here we identify possible convergences of thought about a subject in order to include more than one perspective, ways that we see things coming together, converging in a particular way. Or linking, we can link arms with certain people. You can even use people's names if you want to be really conversational, as Sally and Bob informed me the other day. Or differing, saying, we really seem to have some differences of opinion in this congregation about this. And I want to clearly honor that and try to bring those to bear in what I'm talking about. Linkages, noticing differences and letting those be. Or maybe doing those two things together. And then finally, frame resistance and reframing. There are places where, a particular frame of reference itself is simply not working, and things need to be reframed. It could be any number of things. I was thinking of working on a sermon where, on immigration, where in conversation with a small group of people, and someone was framing the immigrant experience as these were illegals, and somebody reframed that very helpfully, that these are people without papers. Trying to find ways to reframe a particular experience is also an important conversational element. Now, if you're a conversational stylist, then over time, this way of preaching tells your sermon listeners that truth is emergent truth. That Christian truth is emergent truth. It's always on the way. This is sometimes called a congruence theory of truth. Truth emerges in the give and take of collaboration about important topics, and as such, truth is always in process. It's always arriving. It never fully arrives. It's a working communal hypothesis between us that we're working on testing always. And we may find that it's inadequate for our experience at a later date and needs to be revised. So if this is your style, you're inviting the congregation to reason dialogically, to value intersubjective testing and evaluation of concepts before accepting them as true. And in matters of ultimate truth, you're telling your congregation, if this is your style, you're telling them to look for conversational contexts in which there's a high quotient of trustworthiness and truthfulness and authenticity among dialogue partners, and in fact, you're actually working to make them into those dialogue partners. Because that's where ideas are evaluated best for truth across multiple different forms of experience, life worlds, and for appropriateness, really, for application in the immediate situation. They will know the truth, in other words, you're telling them, by coming into community with the truth.
For a lot of people, Jesus' teacher is one of the most common phrases that they know, the teachings of Jesus. Or at least Jesus is like one of the great teachers in the world, that sort of thing. And I think Jesus is one of the great teachers in the world, and has a whole movement has developed around the teachings of Jesus to spread those around. So I want to take a minute and talk here, have you all talk a bit to each other about Jesus' teacher. Really quick, just a minute and a half is how much time you're going to have to do this, to think to yourself or talk to somebody around you about what are some teachings of Jesus that you're familiar with. If you were to have to rattle off a number of really quick responses to the teachings of Jesus, what would be in that list? What are things that you would identify as the content of Jesus as a teacher? All right, I will set a little timer, and you have a minute and a half to talk to each other about this. And then some of you are going to share this out loud as well. So, go.
I'll do it.
I know you could have gone on much longer, all of you. Anybody willing to share what it was that you were hearing? What was the sermons that you were most struck by? What teachings do you know? Anybody over in this section? What's that? What'd you get?
Hate your father, mother, sell all your stuff.
Good one. Yeah, the most famous ones of Jesus, sell everything and give it to the poor and come follow me. That's Jesus' most famous. Yeah. All right, anybody else over here?
Should the widow with two coins, just remember that as a kid. How would you do everything like that?
Good. Others? Anybody up here?
Ryan was talking about like society and culture, and he can share his own words, and I was thinking along those same lines. All the ways that Jesus was in society and said, like the flip stuff, you have heard it said, but I say, and just taking what was kind of normative, acceptable behavior, a lot having to do with the wealthy, and calling them out on it and flipping it around.
Good. Anyone else? Teachings of Jesus or styles? Yeah, Joel.
When you think of like great teachers, he's a great, or like nowadays great teachers, he's a great storyteller, he's a hands-on learner, if you will.
Yeah.
And, obviously you can teach kids things, but they're really just watching them the whole time, so people really just watch what Jesus did and learn from how he lived instead of just him telling you what to do.
Nice. Yeah, you can almost see the Gospels being a more is caught than taught sort of philosophy, right? That's what people see. Anybody else?
Well, I like Victoria commented that it was like that sometimes it's teaching to just a person in a very specific way to that person, and then sometimes in a group context where like the different ways Jesus is teaching.
Yeah, great. Anybody else?
Yeah, we felt like Jesus had like a multi-faceted approach to teaching in a similar way. Like, he wasn't always doing the same thing. He wasn't, like you said before, he's not giving everybody the exact same advice. That can be the mark of a great teacher. Like, seeing that an individual person or individual situation may call for different things.
Excellent. Well, that's kind of what I was going to say today, so that works out great. Yeah, easy speasy. Which I think is one of the teaching philosophies of Jesus, actually, which is there's the kind of teaching where you tell someone something they don't know, right? That's good teaching. I use lots of resources for that. Wikipedia, Google, YouTube videos. I don't know something. I need to acquire some information. I go and get it. That's a great kind of teacher, great kind of learning. That's super important. We should all do it. And I guess there's a sense in which Jesus does some of that. But then there's this other kind of teaching, which is to help a person find the path of discovery of what's happening in them. And I think some of that is going on in the teaching style of Jesus. But I broke up my thoughts into these four ways that I think Jesus teaches in the world. And people said these already, which is either a sign that we're in a mind meld around here and there's no new thought in this room, or perhaps we are onto something and we know a bit of this story. What I'll encourage you to do is to consider the different teachings of Jesus that maybe aren't as natural to you, aren't as common to you, and tap into one of those as you start to expand your understanding of Jesus as teacher. One of these, that Jesus is this memorable, pithy, full of these classic statements kind of teacher. He's actually a serious catchphrase guy, right? You start thinking about things Jesus said, and sometimes they don't feel as much like teachers as they do hashtags. They're these like memorable statements. Jesse threw out one of those. Were you willing to share it in the little group?
Love your neighbor and love your enemy.
Yeah, love your neighbor and love your enemy as you love yourself. Jesus is super famous for that kind of thing. Like if you don't like an overly reductionistic teaching style, Jesus can start rubbing you the wrong way as you find yourself reading. Right? Sell all your possessions and give them to the poor, and then come and follow me. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will see God. Right? This kind of thing was really into that kind of memorable, pithy statements that you would know, and it kind of rings true. Right? They're truisms. They're memorable things. You're like, yeah, I mean, kind of cliche-ish almost. Yeah.
But in oral traditions, the repetition and common language was how do you get information like that. Like there was no other way to do it, so people couldn't take it to memory. No one's writing or reading.
Yeah, no one's taking notes.
You're hearing them, and repetition and what you said is how that happens, right?
Yeah.
Or putting it as a story form or...
Yeah, you are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. That kind of thing. It really it captures, and it's not pithy for the sake of being simple. It's pithy for the sake of being for deepening, right? It carries this kind of weight to it, this kind of meaning to it. Let me talk a bit about that. This "you have heard it said" bit is super important, and then parables, and then the teaching of that which is within you, which I think in some traditions, many of us Protestants or people who are influenced by Protestant Christianity, trust least or trust less than we ought to in the within you part of Jesus' teaching, that thing that's already going on in you. So
we now move on to denotative styles. There are two of those. So we turn from connotative styles and the principle of semantic motion to denotative styles, which are ruled by the principle of what I call semantic arrest. In this style, we act as, I sometimes say, the semantic police. We are out to arrest, to stop the flow of meaning. To denote is to name or to designate. The denotation of a word is its primary accepted first dictionary meaning. Denotative communicators push for correct, accepted, common sense, though that's a troubled term, or universal meanings. So denotation is communication by definition, explanation, and repetition. It is thematic communication par excellence, and it encourages hearers to name, define, and own particular meanings. Whereas over time, the connotative preacher teaches the congregation that truth is disclosive or uncovered, the denotative preacher is telling the congregation over time that truth is something that is decided, it's concluded. Truth is an inference reached by the further explanation of the already true. This is sometimes called paradigmatic truth. Truth is the mining deeper and deeper of a particular paradigm. Truth is an inference reached by the further explication of the already true. It is a finished or final reality that can be asserted and in some cases must be defended. So denotative preachers are satisfied with particular paradigms of thought and commit themselves to the business of exploring those paradigms of thought, those trusted paradigms, further. Okay, the first of the denotative styles is what I call the assertive style. Assertive preaching is ruled by the principle of semantic clarity. The assertive stylist is concerned above all else to achieve clarity. The assertive stylist asserts ideas boldly, clearly, and memorably. And the assertive preacher typically, and this can be a problem, has too much to say and wants to say it all. So sometimes they need to abbreviate their ideas in order to make them manageable. But this is because they are so committed to particular paradigms of thought. Several things are typical of the assertive stylist, and let me wade into those. First of all, what's clear is introductions and conclusions. Assertive stylists will often, if not usually, provide clear introductions to their sermons and clear conclusions. Beginning a sermon or a sequence with a clear statement of what it will be about helps the listener to have a clear path for listening. So introductions are used to orient the congregation to what the preacher is about to say, and some highly structured sermon introductions actually provide a clear statement or even an outline of the general subject that the preacher is addressing in the sermon. So assertive preachers will also often reiterate their ideas at the end. They've told people, then at the end they're going to come back. They're going to remind the hearers of the terrain that's been covered, of what's been said. So conclusions are really important also, summarizing the essential message along with the objectives that the preacher was trying to achieve. So often the importance of the preacher's ideas will be restated and reviewed. And sometimes a sermon conclusion will pose an additional challenge or question for the congregation to consider based on the message that was preached. Okay, so introductions and conclusions are more likely to be very clearly and carefully put together by the assertive stylist. Secondly, emphasis. Assertive preachers will focus more attention on those aspects of the sermon or of a particular idea that are most important for the communication of the overall message. So we will hear assertive preachers lean in and focus on things that are most important, both in the way the sermon is crafted and in the way the assertive preacher uses their voices and body language. These things will focus attention on particular ideas, particular words that are crucial, particular messages or phrases that will help us get clearly what is being said. So emphasis. Thirdly, obvious transitions. Assertive preachers are going to provide hearers clear guideposts that help them follow the train of thought. Transitions and transition words are going to be obvious. We're going to hear, but, and so on, or in contrast, consider this, or not only this, but this, and given this, here's all those kinds of clear transitional signposts, and there are just dozens of them. Those are going to be very well thought through, and they're going to be clear. We're going to hear obvious transitions. All that ambiguity that might be there in the artistic style, for instance, in terms of transitions, are going to be taken away so that the listener does not have to do nearly as much work to know where we are and what we're talking about. Stock patterns are very important for assertive preachers. Assertive preachers are going to make use of stock patterns, and these are patterns that are easily recognized, often used, and can help listeners know with clarity where the preacher is in developing the sermon and what's being said. So some familiar patterns, I'll just list quickly a few of them here. Certainly time patterns. In time patterns, the preacher organizes according to chronological time. Now, this might be just as simple as first, and then second, and third. But there are a lot of other time patterns. For instance, a chronological pattern that discusses the way things are now, and then goes back to speak about how things were in earlier stages, and then comes back and talks about things in the future. Secondly, space patterns or spatial patterns. Sometimes ideas lend themselves to spatial organization on the one side and on the other side and in the middle. Another spatial pattern locates ideas geographically in Jerusalem and in Ephesus. So spatial patterns. Thirdly, faceting patterns. Ideas can also be divided up into facets. A subject can be treated like a diamond that the preacher's holding up, and literally can hold their hand up and kind of turn it, if you will. The body language can help to render this. So that the sermon is being turned slowly, like we're examining facets of a diamond. Fourth, problem solution patterns. Assertive preachers will often analyze a problem and then propose or explain a solution. Now, this is different from narrative preaching, where there's an enigma and a problem, then we go deeper and then we find a clue. No, this is quite different. Here, the assertive preacher will simply state the problem. That's what the sermon's about. We're not going to suddenly have our experiential equilibrium upset. The preacher just simply states a problem and analyzes it, and then proposes a solution or explains the solution. All right, so problem-solution patterns. So those are just a few of the kinds of patterns that are fairly common. A couple of other things. First of all, memorability is important. For the assertive stylist, it's important that things be remembered, and in order to promote clarity, assertive preachers will often take the time to think about memorable ways to state their ideas. This is sometimes called creating a hook or a series of hooks, things that are catchy, that people will remember, so that a particular section of a sermon or the sermon itself can be fully remembered with one catchy kind of hook, if you will. So thinking about memory work and how that can be done is important for this kind of preacher. Repetition is the old anecdote: tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. That's an often repeated creed for the assertive stylist. The repetition of one's ideas at crucial intervals is pivotal for sequential clarity. For instance, the assertive preacher will often repeat a memorable phrase or an approximation of this phrase at the beginning and at the end of each sermon sequence. So repetition, this is another way to open and close each sermon sequence with some statement of what the preacher is talking about, and then to close it with the same statement. And then finally, explanation. Assertive preachers, they achieve clarity by simply explaining what they mean. So you'll often hear the assertive preacher use this particular trope. It's the most common one for explanation. In other words, followed by a short, pithy explanation. Okay, so over time, what is the assertive preacher doing? Well, the assertive preacher over time is telling the congregation that truth takes the form of a decisive ruling or a decision that they have to make, or a declaration based on a shared tradition, a shared paradigm of meaning that's simply being mined for more meaning. Truth assumes a shared paradigm and the decisive truth-bearing reality of one's own tradition or paradigm. So the preacher's telling the congregation that they are to move toward the center of a particular paradigm or a model, not to move toward its boundaries. Going outside of the lines is not what we want to be doing in this style. So the preacher's telling the congregation over time to deduce certain ideas from an already accepted paradigm of more general ideas, such as a confessional system or a set of doctrines or a set of values or beliefs such as feminism or evangelicalism, or a tradition, the Reformed tradition, for instance, or the Wesleyan tradition or whatever. So they are being told over time to accept that much of the groundwork of Christian reasoning has already been done, and their task with the preacher is simply to explore further the conceptual details and the hidden corners of a particular paradigm or set of paradigms. So the congregation is invited to think and discover truth, or to conclude truth with the preacher in a context in which there's a clear canon or paradigmatic tradition of data and warrants that they can bank on. They are simply making further warranted assertions. So truth is a judgment, assertion, decision, or declaration warranted by the further internal development of a particular paradigm or configuration of paradigms. So, for instance, if our major paradigms of thought are Reformed and feminist and evangelical, then those three paradigms and their intersections are going to be where we do all of our work.
Now, the first point that intrigues me about Esther, is that she's passing in the king's house. She's a Jewish woman in a Persian court, primarily because of her beauty and not her brains. She has given up her name, her culture, her heritage, and her identity. Esther is in a place of privilege and denial, a place of co-optation and betrayal, a place of isolation and fragmentation. Esther is cut off from her life force, her roots, her God, her people. She's living in the king's house. And it's not only a geographic removal, but a cultural, religious, and political removal which overturned all the centers of meaning Esther thought were secure. Living in the king's house called into question Esther's way of life and her faith. Living in the king's house called into question Esther's identity and her very relationship to God. The second point that intrigues me about Esther is that when you live in denial, it affects your memory. Esther has sacrificed her memory for the sake of protecting her place.
If she remembers the plight of her people or her crazy relatives that keep on embarrassing her, she will be drawn into their hopeless plight. It's not easy for Esther to remember because remembering is painful. It's binding. It tells us who we are in ways that we are not free to walk away from. Memory is a liability, so it's the first thing that has to go. The loss of her memory, therefore, causes her to sacrifice her role in community. She has become an I person, cut off from her people. She's lost in private definitions. She's lost her grounding in community. Her responsibility for neighbor and self has been replaced. It's no wonder that she's lost touch with the cousin that helped her get to the place and the privilege that she now enjoys. Third point that intrigues me about Esther is that she was not only living in denial without her memory, but the denial and loss of memory had effectively silenced her. She was in a place where she couldn't even speak unless given permission. She was an object of beauty with no ability to see or think or speak or act clearly. Her ability to name the demonic nature of reality had been sacrificed for a position. Her ability to name evil had been clouded by the material comfort that now defines her existence. You can't speak too loudly when you buy into the institutions that control and manipulate you. She's one of the silent ones. She's one of those who won't stand for anything, so they fall for everything. She withdraws. She retreats into privatism, cynicism. She goes through the motions with a forced smile. She engages in ritualistic dancing while her people drift closer and closer to death. And yet, she was placed in the king's house for just such a time as this.
You do not want to hear the words, "It's not a bug, it's a feature," from the computer helpline guy about the spinning wheel of death or some other problem staring you down from your computer screen. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Not words we usually want to hear. On the other hand, I understand that some dedicated cyber gamers actually search out bugs/features, Sherlock-like, intentionally hidden in their computer games by the manufacturers. In these cases, discovering that it's not a bug, it's a feature, must prove pretty rewarding, pretty satisfying. But whether bad news or good, there's no question that in every gospel account of Jesus' experience that first Easter day, doubt is not a bug, but a feature. Doubt is built right into by the original programmers of the resurrection accounts. The earliest ending of the Gospel of Mark has the women fleeing the empty tomb in terror and amazement, and concludes with the words, "And the women said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Not the way a gospel is supposed to end. Matthew's gospel makes it even more explicit. When the disciples saw Jesus, they worshiped him, but some doubted. John's gospel, of course, features the Easter story of doubting Thomas, which concludes with Jesus saying to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." In Luke's account of the resurrection, the risen Jesus says to the disciples at the end of one very long Easter day, "Why are you frightened? And why do doubts arise in your hearts?" And then Luke adds, "While in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, Jesus said to them, 'Have you anything here to eat?'" Doubt, fear, disbelief show up in every gospel account of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. It's almost as though the gospel writers were anticipating that piercing question of your congregation's founding pastor, a question far more urgent, I think, in our day than even in Harry Emerson Fosdick's own. His question, shall the fundamentalists win? Shall those who allow so little room for doubt win? And his answer to which, when will the world learn that intolerance solves no problems? Fosdick's answer constitutes the very cornerstone and rings out with every carillon bell of this grand cathedral and vital body of faith. This anti-fundamentalist, pro-tolerance imperative actually elevates the faithfulness of doubt. And it's contained in each Gospel's depiction of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Doubts are the ants in the pants of faith, Frederick Buechner once said. They keep it alive and moving. We possess no impenetrable assurance of what actually happened that first Easter day. Even among the original cast, Easter does not fit into so tidy a package. The gospel writers build in room for uncertainty. They give us good reason for tolerance and humility in matters of life and faith. Doubt is not a bug, it's a feature in the Christian's resurrection hope.
Okay, the final style of semantic coding, beyond the assertive style, is what I call the defensive style. The defensive communicator is concerned above all else to achieve semantic precision, not semantic clarity. That's not enough for the defensive communicator. Listeners are not only given clear ideas, but ideas that are precise, correct, and singular in meaning. In other words, denotation is taken very seriously. Precisely formulated ideas must be defended against dilution and ambiguity at all costs. All connotation is problematic. Within this style, elements of argument or debate even, such as those employed by lawyers, creep over and are sometimes fundamental to this style. And the principles of persuasive communication are also applicable, or rhetoric especially. Okay, several of these principles are important for preaching. First of all, definition. So we don't want to just explain ideas here. Definition goes one step beyond explanation, for it presumes that you are not only explaining what you mean as the preacher, but no, you are presenting an objective, universally accepted definition for all time. For the defensive preacher, it's very important to discard second and third dictionary definitions or connotations in favor of a correct first primary definition. So sometimes preachers will use Greek and Hebrew word studies or any kind of backup support they can get to aid them in making a final definition of particular terms or ideas. Okay, secondly, opposition. Apologetic styles are often oppositional. There are clear opponents to absolutely correct thinking. So there are clear opponents and clear opposing ideas. So the defensive stylist achieves precision and correctness by diffusing opposing ideas. Third, necessity. Many defensive stylists, apologists, as they are sometimes called, argue that an idea is true by virtue of it being absolutely necessary in order to understand anything or to make sense of God or salvation or life or even reality itself. Everything hangs on this one idea. It's absolutely necessary. This is sometimes called the slippery slope argument. If we let go of this, then this is what happens, then this, then this, then this, and then it's all over. Or domino theory arguments is another common term. Or argument by correspondence. So the defensive preacher will sometimes argue that an idea corresponds with every accepted fact and with all accepted experience. It's true because it corresponds to human experience and with the facts. This is accomplished by showing that an idea is in non-contradiction with the full range of the biblical witness and human experience. Sometimes preachers will provide experiential evidence or all kinds of evidence to support the factuality of an idea. At other times, they will use a series of rhetorical questions that presuppose common knowledge and experience. And finally, arguments from viability are sometimes used. This is the only viable way of thinking. Persuasive apologists often demonstrate that an idea provides a viable explanation of certain existential or spiritual dimensions of human experience, or that it represents a viable answer to major existential or spiritual questions. So arguments from viability. Okay, and then over time, if this is the preacher's style over time, they are basically telling the congregation that truth is a non-negotiable radical. It is not simply an intellectually formulated principle or axiom or a paradigmatic assertion. It is transcendental, without which there could be no being or meaning at all. Truth is held then very tightly and must be defended from those who would render it as merely assertive, or worse still, as in any way connotative. The one who holds the truth, therefore, we're saying over time to our congregation, is a strict semantic positivist who insists on univocal, final, and absolute definitions and meanings for all terms. So over time, the defensive preacher is telling the congregation to trust ideas that are not only rooted in well-warranted paradigms, but which have a more radical, universal, a priori status. If this is your style, you're telling people to bind themselves to certain non-negotiables.
Emil Durkheim, one of the great sociologists of all time, wrote a book entitled The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. And in that particular volume, what Durkheim endeavored to do was to understand how a society, how a culture creates its concept of God. In order to answer that question, he began to analyze a group of people who were indigenous to the interior of Australia, a very primitive group of people just emerging from the Stone Age. They were inventing their culture, and Durkheim had an opportunity to observe a group of people inventing a culture, inventing their concept of God, so to speak. He found that the following process took place. That as this culture came into being, the culture became cognizant of the fact that it had certain desirable social traits. Every culture has certain desirable social traits, certain characteristics that make up the cultural syndrome. He noticed that this group of people sensed that there were certain traits that they found desirable for their children to possess, that they actually communicated to their children and inculcated into their consciousness. These are what we call the dominant cultural values. That was the earliest thing that he observed. Then he noticed something else. Little by little, the dominant cultural values came to be symbolized by the people of this culture, and they tended to be symbolized with certain animals. For instance, if the dominant cultural value was strength, strong as a bear, wise as an, very good, sly as a, hey, you're on. Do you notice everybody since Carl Jung, the psychologist, was aware that almost subconsciously we identify certain social traits with certain animals, do you see? Animals become symbolisms. They become what we call totems. And when an animal is utilized to symbolically represent the collective values of a tribe, of a group of people, we call it a totem, from whence we get our term totem pole. The totem, the animal that symbolizes the tribe, that somehow incarnates the values which the tribe feels that it wants to possess, that it inculcates into its children, that it finds the most desirable. The third stage in this evolutionary development is simple. Little by little, the tribe comes to worship the animal. Little by little, the tribe comes to worship the animal, which is nothing more than a symbolic representation of its own collective values. Worships the animal, which is nothing more than a symbolic expression of its own social traits. The animal which becomes venerated as an object of worship, once again, is a symbolic representation of the values which the tribe itself perceives itself as possessing. And thus Durkheim comes to the final conclusion of his analysis. If the tribe is worshiping an animal which is nothing more than a symbolic representation of its own collective values, when the tribe worships the animal, what is it really worshiping? And the answer is, the tribe is worshiping themselves. Their God is themselves. And what they call a deity is simply a symbolic representation of themselves. And so it was Durkheim's conclusion that religion is a process whereby a group of people end up worshiping an externalized version of their own collective traits. Religion is a process whereby people worship themselves. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that is obviously true of those totemistic cultures, those primitive societies. But I want to say that the Apostle Paul understood that particular process as well, as he so eloquently states the process of totemism in the first chapter of Romans, as he reminds us that people took the image of the incorruptible God and transformed him into what? Into an image likened unto corruptible beast, unto four-footed beast, and unto corruptible men, and they worship the creation rather than the Creator. In short, Paul summarizes in a brilliant way a process that sociologists have expounded in a more elaborate fashion in such books as the one written by Durkheim. In short, we who in the United States pride ourselves in worshiping Jesus Christ have to ask ourselves this very simple question. Is the Jesus that we worship, is the Jesus that we propagate, is the Jesus that we declare really the Jesus of Scripture? Or have we set aside the Jesus of Scripture and have created in his place another Jesus, which is nothing more than a symbolic representation of our own collective traits and our own collective values?
So here again is the chart, if you will. You can see on one side message and organization, and then truth as. So we've got the connotative style, meaning in motion. Truth is unveiled or uncovered, disclosive truth. And then two styles, artistic style, meaning delayed artfully, conversation style, meaning delayed dialogically. The artistic style promoting an epiphanic model of truth. Truth is an aha, and I get it. Or it's emergent, it's getting clearer. And then on the denotative style, where meaning is arrested and truth is concluded, the assertive style, we see meaning arrested through clear, careful assertion, and defensive style, meaning is argued and defended. And in the congregation, where over time we're saying truth is decisive, it's perfectly clear, or it's final, it's this and only this for all time. So those are fairly hyperbolic statements, just to make the point. But these are the sort of basic ways in which we can begin to see how, in fact, meaning is organized within sermons, or what I call the semantic code.